Hey folks, today I want to tell you about a man by the name of Amor De Cosmos. He was interesting, controversial even in his own time for a wide variety of reasons. He was considered eccentric, annoying, and full of himself by his contemporaries, and historians often portray him as very misanthropic in contrast to his very public life as a politician and newspaperman. De Cosmos never married, and he didn't seem to have very many close friends, but he considered himself a politician of the people, at least the white ones anyway. He founded a newspaper that took jabs at his political adversaries. He is considered to be a father of Confederation, but if you ask your typical British Columbian or even a Canadian who Amor De Cosmos was, most of them probably wouldn't know. So I want to try and tell more people about this guy because he was really weird and interesting and also important to the foundation of modern Canada, I guess. In this video, I want to explore the life and times of Amor De Cosmos to better understand the man who many historians have described as an enigma. Amor De Cosmos was born in Nova Scotia in 1825, but he spent most of his life in Victoria, where he is also now buried. If we were to take a look at the headstone that marks that burial, we would find not one name, but two. When he was born, his parents announced him to the world as William Alexander Smith, and he did hold on to that name for about the first 2 decades of his life, before he decided on something a bit more illustrious. But we'll come to that in a minute. William Alexander Smith had pretty humble origins, working as a grocery clerk with a company called Whitman and Company. Back in those days, we actually respected grocery clerks and paid them a livable wage, so it wasn't a bad life. But eventually, news came from California, and it was golden. The California gold rush was in full swing, and people from all across North America and even across the pond came rushing to stake their claim and make it big. William also heard this news and decided that he also wanted to head west and venture into California. He had a number of options, but he ultimately decided to go for the long, slow, and cheap route. He took a caravan across the width of North America. William's party was forced to winter in Salt Lake City, spending several months just waiting to get back on the road until the ground began to thaw and the snow began to melt, allowing them to head out on the path to riches once again. At one point, as they were finally marching close to California, it seems that William grew impatient and decided to take a horse and head out on his own ahead of the rest of the party. What he didn't take into account was that he was about to cross the Great Salt Lake Desert. I am told that this great stretch of barren land is a very arduous stretch of the journey, and that there is no drinkable water for about 3 days. There is water, but the alkali content is so high that it can actually kill animals and can cause a bout of unfortunate symptoms in human beings, like vomiting, lethargy, confusion, oral pain, and more. All things you don't want to experience while in an unfamiliar land where help is very unlikely to arrive should you require it. William's brother, Charles McIver Smith, actually wrote about William's adventure across the expanse of North America, and it's from these records that we know that William drank from the alkali water source, ambled off track, and nearly died on his journey to California. He somehow managed to stagger back onto the correct path and find some clean drinking water, but before long he eventually arrived in California, in a bit rougher shape than when he left Salt Lake City, but nonetheless alive and well. One of the first things he did in California, after presumably resting for a little bit, was go down to the courthouse and petition to have his name, William Alexander Smith, changed to Amor De Cosmos. There was much debate around allowing him to do this, but in the end he stated, "I desire not to adopt the name of Amor De Cosmos because it smacks of foreign title, but because it is an unusual name, and its meaning tells what I love most: love of order, beauty, the world, the universe." And his petition was granted, and from then on, our humble grocery clerk from Nova Scotia was known as Amor De Cosmos. The caravan that he had previously traveled with arrived in California 3 weeks after he did, and he had not entrusted them with the tools and materials needed to mine a vein of gold, but instead, when they arrived, he went and picked up his photographer's tools. William made his money photographing miners with their plots, and when his brother Charles arrived a few years later, they worked in tandem, making their way by speculating and taking photographs of the land. As far as I know, none of these photos still exist, so anything that I'm showing on screen is just an example of what they might have been taking pictures of. But once again, Amor De Cosmos was getting antsy, and the gold in California was beginning to dry up. But good news came to California in 1858, because gold had been found in the Fraser Valley, north up past the American border and into the heart of a British colony called British Columbia. If you were a miner in California that wanted to go north, you first had to stop in a little village, a former Hudson's Bay Company outpost called Victoria, to obtain your mining license. Here you could purchase your license, of course, as well as any other number of provisions and tools before heading onto your journey to the Fraser Valley. At the time, the population of Victoria was a few hundred settlers, but within about a month of that news story going out, the population absolutely exploded to the tens of thousands. Amor De Cosmos was on one of the first boats from California, and when he arrived on this rainy little island, he had initially decided to get into the fishing and lumber business. But instead, what he decided this place needed was an honest newspaper. Now, he wasn't the only one to have this idea, because about 10 newspapers started between 1858 and 1860. But as Gordon Hawkins writes in his book, The De Cosmos Enigma, some newspapers lasted 2 to 4 years. Others took only a few months to disappear. But with flair, fluency, a recognizable target or two, and a capacity for righteous indignation, all of which De Cosmos came to possess in abundance, a long street life could be assured. On December 11th, 1858, the British Colonist published its very first issue, and it is actually still around today. You can still purchase this newspaper at grocery stores and the like, or more likely you can read their articles online, but nowadays you might know it as the Times Colonist. I feel like we know enough about De Cosmos' character at this point that when I tell you that he almost immediately used his newspaper to criticize and attack politicians that he didn't like, we really shouldn't be surprised. In particular, he had it out for Sir James Douglas, the former chief factor of the Hudson's Bay Company and the current governor of the colony of Vancouver Island. De Cosmos got his feet under him in Victoria and almost immediately started taking swings at the top of the political food chain. With his barbed comments on the governance of the colony, a regular feature of the British colonist publications, it really was just a matter of time before he decided to enter that arena himself. De Cosmos saw himself as a politician, but the current politicians didn't want him anywhere near their decision-making chambers and did everything in their power to try and keep him out. Hawkins writes that De Cosmos regarded purposeful agitation as his calling and showed himself as a foe of unearned privilege and the family company compact, which did indeed make up most of local politics at the time. After retiring as an editor from The Colonist, Amor De Cosmos made his first foray into attempting to be elected into a political position, and it didn't go well. When he first campaigned, another settler by the name of John Helmicken wrote that Amor De Cosmos had gotten up on stage and told of his adventures in California and how he was the most rootin' tootin' guy around and he had a revolver in each of his boots. And Helmicken also wrote that De Cosmos appeared to be quite drunk throughout this entire ordeal. The next day, the British colonist wrote that his voice was rendered feeble by illness. It's interesting because Amor De Cosmos might not have been an editor anymore, but he was still in fact the owner of this paper, so bit of a bias there. Despite the drunkenness, this attempt at politics might actually have been successful if his arch nemesis, the Governor James Douglas, had not interfered. There had recently been a group of African Americans who had also recently arrived from California, and through a little bit of bureaucratic fudgery, they were given the right to vote specifically for this election. Unable to win their vote, Amor De Cosmos suffered his first defeat in politics, and I suppose somewhat unsurprisingly, not long after, those African American settlers had their right to vote rescinded. De Cosmos was not one to be deterred, though, and he tried running for a different election a few months later, but the deck was still stacked against him. The government decided that because his name was registered in California, because remember, when he first arrived there, he changed his name, etc., etc., the government decided that because he had his name registered in California, he could not stand in an election on the colony of Vancouver Island unless he referred to himself as William Alexander Smith, also known as Amor De Cosmos. If you were legally able to vote at the time, you had to say that whole thing, otherwise your vote didn't count. He lost this election because somebody simply voted for De Cosmos. This was the early days where all of the rules were truly made up, because it was later revealed that the voter list was completely out of date, and the guy who called the winner of the election actually did not have the authority to do so. Politics are wild today, but they were insane back then. However, in 1863, Amor De Cosmos finally won a seat in the Legislative Assembly of Vancouver Island, officially cementing himself as a very prominent figure in British Columbia's history. He would go on to be a part of two very important confederations. The first occurred in 1866 when the colony of Vancouver Island joined and became a part of the colony of British Columbia. Once Vancouver Island joined BC, plans to join Canada were already in motion. Because remember, at this time, Vancouver Island and British Columbia, prior to joining, were two separate British colonies. They were not a part of Canada yet, they were their own thing. When it came to British Columbia and its future, there were kind of three options on the table. We could be annexed by the United States and join them. We could remain a British colony, or we could join Canada, and this was the option that Amor De Cosmos threw his support behind. The Confederation League was very quickly founded in order to gain public support for BC joining Canada, and De Cosmos was an early member. In 1871, terms of Confederation were agreed upon, and British Columbia officially joined Canada. De Cosmos' illustrious political career, though, was far from over, because he shortly thereafter became the second Premier of British Columbia. For my non-Canadian viewers, a Premier is like the leader of the province, so when I say that Amor De Cosmos was the Premier of British Columbia, I mean like he was in charge of the entirety of British Columbia. In order to tell you about this next bit and how Amor De Cosmos' stint as a Premier came to a rather abrupt end, I need to tell you about a transcontinental railway. There were many articles and deals that were struck made to sweeten the deal for Confederation between British Columbia and Canada, and that included Article 11, which afforded the construction of a railway between British Columbia and the rest of the country. This would help move people, goods, and business out towards BC, not leaving them out of that sweet, sweet Eastern Canadian economy. The thing is, it takes a real long time to build a railroad, especially when that railroad is going across what is today the second largest country in the world. But the timeline was making people anxious. Everyone had agreed to the terms of Confederation, but would Canada actually follow through? For what it's worth, it seems like Amor De Cosmos did what he could to renegotiate the terms of Confederation in order to expedite the construction efforts for the railway to the West Coast. But at the end of the day, his opponents were able to capitalize on people's anxieties and fears about the railway potentially not being completed. On February 7th, 1874, a mob stormed the legislature of British Columbia, forcing it to adjourn early. People were very dissatisfied with Amor De Cosmos, and within 2 days, Amor De Cosmos had submitted his resignation as Premier. He was not fully out of the political arena yet, as he was still a member of Parliament, But at this point in his life, all of his biggest political achievements were now a thing of the past. We've been talking a lot about Amor de Cosmos and his activities in politics, but we haven't really been talking much about what his politics were, aside from the fact that he was obviously pro-Confederation with Canada. He also believed that a government should be made up of elected representatives, not appointed representatives. He believed in the power of the people. But if you ask me which people, this is where it gets a bit sticky. When it came to religion, he held the very firm belief that church and state should be kept wholly separate, and was actively against the forcing of Christianity and religion on Indigenous peoples of Canada. With all of this being said, a liberal attitude will only get us so far with a colonial politician during this time. De Cosmos, like many of his contemporaries, had very poor views on Indigenous peoples, which I am not going to repeat because his views are gross. But I will mention this because it is relevant today and a lot of movements that are occurring around the country. Amor de Cosmos was against many of the Indigenous land concessions, and he felt that certain governments were being too lenient and that this was going to get in the way of legitimate, quote, settlement of the land. He also had some really bad opinions on Chinese settlers because, in his view, they refused to assimilate into white culture. Chinese settlers were the primary workforce on the transcontinental railway that we just discussed, and Amor de Cosmos, I guess, had a problem with this and tried to pass a resolution or a law basically banning anybody with hair longer than 7 inches from working on the railway. The reason for this seemingly odd ban is because during this era, Chinese men wore their hair in a queue. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And by banning any men with long hair from working on this railway, it would prevent pretty much the entire Chinese workforce on the railway from being able to earn a living. Ironically, when he first tried to get this ban passed, Amor de Cosmos was himself sporting a very shaggy head of hair that is reported to have been much longer than 7 inches. Funnily enough, though, he wasn't quite racist enough to win back his seat in 1882 when a guy named Noah Shakespeare, who was running on a very virulent anti-Chinese platform, won the seat and de Cosmos retired from political life. Despite his prominent political role, de Cosmos was still very much considered very eccentric by his contemporaries. He was notably terrified of electricity, refused to have anything to do with it, refused to ride the streetcars, refused to have it installed in his house, and he even went so far as to say that it should be illegal to construct a telephone pole outside of somebody's house without their consent. He also at one point tried to create a hot food delivery service to the miners in the Klondike, which, while I'm sure the miners of the 1860s would have loved to have had Uber Eats 150 years early, but I think Amor de Cosmos was a little ahead of his time on that one. Though he was always considered a pretty eccentric fellow, the last few years of the life and times of Amor de Cosmos was marked by a steep decline in mental and physical health. There is a lot of speculation amongst historians about his very odd nature and his eccentricities, and there's a lot of people that think that maybe because he drank from that alkali water source, or maybe he inhaled some of the fumes from when he was a photographer, are all some theories about why he was kind of just an odd guy. But I think sometimes when we look at the weird guys of history, we try and explain away why they might act the certain way that they do. But I think a lot of people kind of overlook the fact that neurodivergent people exist and have always existed. So it is my personal theory that Amor de Cosmos, while he may have ingested something that he should not have that maybe affected him later in life, I think that the guy was just neurodivergent. But I am not a psychologist, and we will never truly know what this guy's deal was, and that is okay. The health of Amor de Cosmos deteriorated, and in 1895 he was declared of unsound mind. His brother, Charles, cared for him until his death in 1897. In general, I find that a lot of Canadians are extremely disconnected from their history, and I think a big reason for that is because it is so inaccessible. For example, if you want to learn about a specific Roman emperor, you can find dozens of books and documentaries written in multiple languages from different perspectives. But when I was doing the research for Amor De Cosmos, I think there was only one book written after like 1980 that I could refer to, which is really weird because I feel like given the current political situation in Canada, I feel like we need to be looking backwards. We need to be looking at how these systems came to be, why they're in place, and try to understand them so that we can make them better and more equal. But what do I, a humble historian slash YouTuber, know? I hope this video helps make Canadian history even a tiny little bit more accessible. I'm definitely going to be doing more Canadian history on the channel in the future, so please subscribe if that is something that you're interested in. I also talk a lot about museums on this channel if that is your bag and want to come along on this very odd journey with me. Next week, I am going to be releasing a museum history news segment, which is very new to this channel, but it'll help you keep up to date with what's happening on the international history and museum scene. So be sure to hit notifications so you don't miss it. Thank you for sticking it out to the end of this video. I really do appreciate it. And I hope that wherever you are, you have a wonderful day or evening, and I will see you next time. The thing is, it takes a long time to build a railroad. A railroad. It takes a long time to build a railroad.